Hi, it's Dwyer with the sun in his eyes. It is August 19th, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Folks, this morning in my favorites video, in my favorites list of videos, there is one of the most important videos I've ever placed. It's a video on one of the absolute best fighters I've ever seen. Right? Let's figure out real boxing history. This guy couldn't sustain it because he had some personal demons. But I need for people to look at the video on Hector Camacho. Right? Let me just tell you, by chance, I was watching TV. They had Camacho live from Puerto Rico. He was fighting Bazooka Limon. And by chance, this is how life operates. The celebrity boxing commentator was Ray Leonard. And there is a moment in that Camacho Limon fight where the other guy turns to Leonard and says, Camacho has hand speed like yours. And understand, in the 1980s, we considered Ray Leonard's hand speed to be the gold standard. And Leonard corrects him and says, no, no, no. This guy's hand speed is much faster than mine. And I'm just telling you, Ray was right. Right? Camacho had blinding hand speed. And let me say this. He's two-handed, unlike Manny Pacquiao. And he was much more fluid. In other words, Camacho was just bouncing around Bazooka Limon. That's a moment in time. You understood this was the best in the division. This was the level of talent where you were watching Camacho and you were asking yourself questions like, is this the fastest hand speed I've seen? Right? And understand, Camacho was surgical. He wasn't just throwing hand speed. He was throwing hand speed and varying the punches. Right? This was a unique talent. Understand, too, he was the king of New York City. You knew in New York City there was Hector Camacho, and then there was everyone else. This is in the pre-Mike Tyson era. Right? This is the early part of the 1980s. And Camacho won 3 gold gloves. 3. And he was the man. You know, you knew he was a future champ. When you saw him, there was no one like him. Now, truth be told, there was another fighter who I thought might be more skilled than Camacho. Salvador Sanchez. Understand how good Sanchez was. Whenever they interview Roy Jones and they asked Roy Jones who his idols were, Jones always mentioned Salvador Sanchez. Right? Sanchez did the unthinkable. He backs into a corner against Wilfredo Gomez. And of course, that sequence ends with Gomez hitting the canvas. Well, let me just say, other than Salvador Sanchez, let's just say it was a short list, very short, when you thought, who's the best in the sport outside of Larry Holmes? And that list surely included Hector Camacho, right? This was the young man who owned the world, right? Now I'm talking about Camacho in his early 20s. Now, the people around you and young people, the burden's on you. You need to take the step forward and you need to talk with these folks. One of my regrets in life is that when an older generation than me was around, I didn't take the time to fully ask them about the 40s and 50s. The people around you who are in their mid to late 50s, early to mid 60s. You need to talk to them about the 1980s. Folks, things were nuclear back then, right? We thought the President of the United States was absolutely crazy, right? I'm talking about in a way Donald Trump's not. Reagan scared the daylights out of everyone, right? Certainly people of color, right? At one point, Reagan tried to claim that ketchup was a vegetable, should be considered a vegetable for school lunch purposes. Just understand how crazy the 80s were. I'm going to name a list of people who were alive and thriving in the 1980s who died way too young, because the 1980s in the beginning had a major, and I mean major, cocaine problem, right? And understand, we didn't have all the resources people have now, right? We didn't have, the internet, right? This was back in the era where people didn't even have cell phones. In other words, folks would disappear for days. And when they reappeared, keep in mind, this is even before telephone answering machines, for the very early part of the 1980s. When they reappeared, they just acted like everything was normal. Right? You couldn't call them and leave a voicemail. If they were living with their families, you would call and the phone would ring and ring and ring and no one would pick it up. Right? So in the 80s, just understand, I'm not saying these people died in the 80s. What I am saying is they died too young, in part because of substance abuse problems. Folks, Prince died too young. Michael Jackson died too young. Right? Jackson's interesting because there are allegations that he was a pedophile. Right? And this was a guy who was also a stunningly creative artist. Right? I remember watching videos from Thriller and I thought, what's Michael doing with the high water pants? Right? Then he was wearing one glove. Put it this way, this was an artist who was well ahead of his time. Right? He was doing things that were bizarre in the moment that turned out to be the standard. Tom Petty is dead. Sam Kinison, if you remember him, he died too early. Rick James, who you knew had a drug problem in the 1980s, he died too early. Understand how big cocaine was. The New York Mets won the World Series in 1986. Star pitcher Dwight Gooden missed the parade. By his own admission, he was in a drug den with his dealer at the time. Right? Chris Rock puts the 80s best. Right? He talks about how, there was a drug problem in the 80s, and then suddenly, in around 87, there was crack. You didn't know where it came from. But let's just say you had the raging drug problem, and then you had the raging drug problem on steroids. Right? Let me say, too, I used to tutor in Harlem. A high school teacher gave me this assignment. At the time, I was cursing him. Now I realize the guy really saved my life. I believe I got into a great college because, I had a tutoring background in Harlem. Well, let me just say, this is in the 80s. This is in the early 80s. I'm talking to kids. I had to learn to stop asking kids personal questions. And by personal, I mean, you're talking to kids who you're tutoring, and you say, hey, Tell me about your parents. And you know the rest. I heard stories about dad who's in some penitentiary someplace doing time. I'm hearing stories about mom juggling a drug problem. Right, folks, that was commonplace in Harlem, at least among the kids I tutored in the early 80s. Now, this relates to boxing because, as you'll find out, watching the video in my favorites folder, Hector Camacho, at a time when he was the king of New York, one of the absolute best fighters I've ever seen in my life, at a time when he had hand speed that's rare, right? You know, you have to think of Manny Pacquiao level hand speed to figure out Camacho's hand speed, right? Hector Camacho, according to this video that I've posted in my favorites folder, was a cokehead, right? Understand, boxing was different in the 80s. The 80s are the decade where Panama Lewis in a big fight, right? Aaron Pryor, the Hawk, great fighter, against another great fighter, Alexis Arguello, who's trying to annex the 140-pound crown. Arguello has the upper hand. It looks like the Hawk is beaten up. You're wondering whether Hawk is going to survive the next round. Panama Lewis asked for a bottle in the corner, Hawk's corner, right? Then the mic catches Lewis saying, "Not that one, the one I mixed." The cameras then show a different bottle being given to Aaron Pryor. Now, at the time, the only thing you could legally give a fighter was water. Panama Lewis would later claim that the bottle he mixed had Perrier water in it, carbonated water. And, you know, it was Lewis's way of saying, I followed the rules, the carbonation just lifted a fighter, right? Well, here's what we know. Pryor, who later developed a drug problem, great fighter. Pryor comes out the next round and is rejuvenated. Folks, it's jarring on film. Pryor goes on to beat Alexis Arguello. Who knows if it's on the up and up? Right? Then, of course, they have the rematch. Pryor legitimately beats Alexis Arguello in the rematch. But you and I know boxing is based on moments. Who cares who would have won the Mike Tyson, Buster Douglas rematch? Right? The first fight, both guys needed a level playing field. Right? Understand that Panama Lewis clip really undermined what was a great fight, right? Hawk against Arguello. And just understand, we don't know what happened. We don't know that today. What we do know is that Hawk would later develop drug problems. So let me say this about Camacho, and it's very important. I haven't even made it through the video. I made it through about the first 40%, and I had to back away from the video because it's just too vivid, right? We've seen people fall off pedestals. The fall off the pedestal that Camacho suffered was so substantial. This video is uncomfortable. It's hard to watch. But understand what they're telling you on the video. The night before a fight, and by the way, this shows you how absurd drug testing was in the 80s. The night before a big fight against John Montez, Camacho was so coked up, this is with people in the room, that Camacho thought about jumping out his hotel window. So Camacho literally had to be talked off the ledge by the other people in the room. This is how the 80s were. The next day, Camacho had his big fight. The fight did not make it out of the first round. That was the talent level we're talking about. Things are a little bit different today, right? Today, I believe 25% of boxing, I have no proof, I'm speculating, I believe 25% of boxing is using PEDs, right? There's a conspiracy of silence today. In the 80s, it's cocaine. Understand, life was so much more reckless. It's not like people in the 80s were counting red blood platelets and stuff like that. No, folks are getting drugs from street dealers, right? You understand that musicians have issues. I'm sure the Met Clubhouse, who had a number of guys who ended up with drug problems, I'm sure they knew that teenager Dwight Gooden was a recreational drug user, right? Well, just understand, the people around Camacho knew that Camacho was using cocaine. According to the video that's in my favorites folder right now, Camacho's mother busted him with cocaine at the house when Camacho was 17 years old. I'm not talking about a guy dabbling in drugs. No, I'm talking about a guy with a drug habit. And he was dominating boxing. Right? Let me just say, it was interesting for me personally, because we get to the late 80s and I saw Camacho struggling against guys who I knew. Early 80s Camacho would just dominate. Right? Camacho was never a one-punch guy. He was a combination guy. Right? But just understand, in the 80s, you could have a full-blown coke habit and still be a champion in boxing. Right? Very, very, very different era. Let me say this too. In the 90s, Tommy Morrison's no longer with us. Right? Just understand, Tommy Morrison toward the end openly admitted to using steroids, right? And yet he's having big fights against people like Razor Ruddock, George Foreman in the 1990s, right? This is 10 years after Camacho, and wasn't busted, right? You have to look back at that era, look at the bodies, and ask yourself, how many guys were juicing? How long was this going on? So please take a moment, just watch the beginning of the Camacho video, right? Watch at least the first third of it, and let's just say you're going to be surprised. If you don't know how good Camacho was, they have footage, and you'll see he's catching guys clean. His hands are so fast that against contenders, he's hitting guys flush. The guy doesn't even have enough time to put a hand up. The guy doesn't know what's coming toward him. Right? They also tell you, too, about his private life, Camacho's life coming up. Understand, Camacho apparently got thrown out of multiple schools on his way up. Right? This is the guy who, let's just say, might have been using cocaine to self-medicate. not for recreation. Right? Take a look at the video. It's an eye-opener. You might want to talk to granddad, grandma, auntie, uncle, and say, hey, was there a period of the 1980s that was out of control? Hear what they have to say. Right? Let's just say there's certain times, late 60s, right? The mid to late 70s, the 80s, that by today's standards were completely out of control. Right? Completely out of control. As I like to tell people, rewatch Game 1 of the 1988 World Series. Right? That's the Oakland A's against the Los Angeles Dodgers. Right? Now, I'm just telling you, they've covered up history. Jose Canseco, one of the best baseball players I've ever seen. When he went 40-40, folks, that was a moment for me. It was like watching prime Bo Jackson. I mean, I'm talking about different level of athlete. Well, he's at bat. And understand, forget all this we didn't know what was going on nonsense that people want you to believe now. The crowd breaks out in a chant at Dodger Stadium. And that chant is steroids, steroids, steroids. Right? That's in a World Series game. It's all throughout the stadium. We knew at the time that Jose Canseco was juicing. This is years before the Mitchell report. Understand, if you hit clubs, you knew something was going on. In fact, if you watch wrestling, you knew something was going on because you'd be in a club and suddenly, it was like over a 3-year period of time, suddenly every bouncer had necks the size of your waist and looked like they were Mr. Universe. It was like sudden. Right? Understand, wrestling, same type thing. Look at the wrestlers at the start of the 80s. Bruno Sammartino, people like that. Then you get to the meat of the 80s, and every wrestler was muscle bound. Right? Understand how ridiculous it was. You would have an NFL draft, and they would then have a guy, in fact, a combine. This would happen before the draft. You'd be looking at the combine, and suddenly there would be a guy at the combine who you had never heard of, who was not from some big school, not from University of Texas or Ohio State or Michigan, right? These factory schools, Penn State, back in the Joe Paterno era. Can we say his name? Right? Just understand, you would see a guy and you would have never heard of the guy. And the guy would be one of the best athletes you've ever seen in your life. Right? Then the guy would be in the NFL and the guy would be getting a lot of sacks. I'm not going to say any names. I have to think about defamation laws and stuff like that. I don't have hard proof. But let's just say it was a running joke by the end of the 80s about these football prospects having acne running down their back and how the guy was built. Right? It was a running joke because we understood not just cocaine, but steroids were just running through sports. And I'm not talking about HGH. I'm not talking about, other PEDs, EPO, right? Which of course ran roughshod through the world of cycling. No, I'm talking about steroids that bulked you up, right? Everyone wanted to look good. Well, just understand, we couldn't detect obvious steroid use in the latter part of the 80s, right? When Ben Johnson, look at how built he was. When Ben Johnson was busted for steroid use at the Seoul Olympics, we were surprised, or at least we pretended to be, right? In fairness to Ben Johnson, you had another athletic group where several members had problems with cough syrup, we'll call it, right? The era, let's just say the era had some interesting coaches who just popped up and who had a bevy of world class sprinters and stuff like that. That's how the 80s ended. Well, the early part of the 80s, right, is a Coke era. And understand, Hector Camacho appears to have had a Coke problem throughout his early 20s, which is, of course, a period in which he was one of the most dominant fighters in boxing. Take a look at the video. Let me know your thoughts. Ask the older people around you while you have the opportunity. Let me just say, I did talk with some older people of color, and in an earlier time when I was a little kid, about the 1950s, right? And let's just say, my goodness, it's like, I can just tell you, black people, the 40s had World War II, right? Black people just viewed the 1950s as a showcase. In other words, we forget how opulent it must have seemed, right? Think 57 Chevy, right? Think well-conked Nat King Cole type hairstyle, right? Think black people, and I know the comparison here doesn't fully translate to the day, but I talked with some older black people, and they were telling me about seeing us on TV, right? I know black people weren't on TV in the 50s that much, but, Nat King Cole for a period of time had a show on TV, right? You need to ask yourself, how much in the background were black people before the 50s? Right now, suddenly, here's the 50s, here's a black man on TV, and he's dressed like Nat King Cole. He has a current hairstyle, current for the time, right? He has that Nat King Cole hairstyle, and he's not playing a step and fetch it role, right? This is the brother who is, a hipster, who's a singer, who's into music, who's in a culture, right? Let's just say perceptions get lost over time. Use this Hector Camacho early 80s opportunity to talk with the older people around you to find out how it was. Rick James, I'll just put it this way. I know Dave Chappelle made Rick James a punchline, right? And that's from the early 90s, right? That's how much Rick overdid it in the 80s, right? He's a punchline by the time of Chappelle's show in the early 90s, right? But Rick was a great showman, right? I went to a Rick James concert. Wow, I'm not sure if I've been to a better concert, right? Rick had the crowd rolling, right? Rick was serious. Of course, in the 80s, Rick also, according to reports, took a woman hostage. He and his girlfriend took a woman hostage at his mansion. There were all kind of drug fuel stories, as you could imagine. That was the era. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.